Good evening, everybody. Thanks for attending. I will tell you that what I discovered in the research for this book over the last 5 years were things that I didn't know clearly, but I'd venture that most of us tonight know a lot about Joshua Huddy and probably somewhat less, but also enough about Colonel Ty to make this an interesting discussion. I started this project because, like you, I had heard about these stories and legends over time, and some of the things that I heard didn't jive, and I wanted to get to as close as I could to the truth, as always. So we will start here, I hope, with the following. Dana, did that come up?
Yes, it did. We're on a
Oh,
Shrewsbury runaway.
there we go. And the image came up too, right?
Yep.
Okay, great. So, just to introduce these two men who were obviously key players during the Revolution, I want to start with this. I want you to notice the date on what is a runaway slave ad. I hope you know that these were very, very common when enslaved people would run away, particularly young men, as in this case, their owners were really furious to get them back, and they would take out ads like John Corliss did in this one. He put this ad in both the Philadelphia Gazette and the New York newspapers as well. Couple of highlights here, as you can see. John Corliss, may surprise you to know, was a Quaker. Not all Quakers were abolitionists. By this year, 1775, when he took up the ad, quite a lot of the Quakers had come to see the abolition of enslaved people as a primary goal, but not all of them. What's also interesting about this ad is two other things. The date. Keep that in mind for a few seconds, if you would. November 8th that year. And the way he describes this Negro man named Titus. You'll see that he says he's about 21, not very black, which is a hint about something to us. Tall guy, nearly 6 foot high. He has on a home gray spun coat, brown breeches, etc., etc. And the reason he did this, as do most of the people who take out runaway slave ads, to get back what they considered their property, these human beings, was that they hoped that people would recognize them because in most cases, these people ran away when they had an opportunity, which means with the clothes on their back. And so someone must have alerted uh, John Corliss to what Titus had on when he ran away. The other hint here about this man that we're going to find out a lot about, I hope, is that he's not very black. And that might suggest to you right away, as I hope it does, that he was probably a mixed race person. The No doubt the son of a white man and the uh, daughter, or I should say, the son of a black enslaved woman, who I believe, by the way, in another record we have, was a woman named Sarah. And as I did my investigations, which are outlined in detail in the book, it's likely that Titus was either John Corley's half brother or possibly even his son. And this was a common phenomenon in the days of slavery everywhere in our country, that white slaveholding men would impregnate their female slaves because A, they wanted their own pleasure, of course, but because they knew that by law, the birth of those people would keep them enslaved, and they would therefore grow their crop, which is what they thought of this as. Again, as you well know, they didn't think of these people as people. They thought of them as property. So this ad comes out in the newspapers. And there's more to the John Corley story. This is a partial list of, basically, it was a tax list where the constable went around Monmouth County, particularly Shrewsbury in this case, and tried to get an understanding of how many enslaved people there were on each property. And startlingly enough, we see a lot of very common Monmouth County names, including the underlined John Corliss, who's got 4 enslaved people. but they never named the slaves because they weren't deemed worthy of being mentioned by name. And you'll also notice here in this little excerpt, and I'll show you the full one later, that John Corliss is among the richest of farmers in Shrewsbury because he's got most of the slaves. So it's a good indicator where that family was. And it turns out both he, his father, and his grandfather, three generations of a family were slaveholders. Now, just to give you an idea where this was, we've often been told and read, of course, that this happened in Shrewsbury, and indeed it did, but it really happened at the far eastern end of the Rumson Neck Peninsula, which was then part of Shrewsbury. And the red outline that I have here is where the 300 or 400 acre farm that the Corliss family had was. Right at the tip of Rumson today, as you can see, across from Seabright and then down South Monmouth Beach. So that's where they lived. It was quite a prime piece of property. It turns out that as Quakers were becoming more and more aware of the dire state of the enslaved, that what would happen, and it did happen to John Corliss at least twice that we have record of, is Quaker elders from the Shrewsbury meeting, which is the same meeting but not the same house, as is at the Four Corners in Shrewsbury today. They would send 3 or 4 elders to talk to people, like in this case, John Corliss, and they would try to encourage Corliss to treat his enslaved people better. Now, we have a record because the Quakers are very, very good at keeping records. And this is an excerpt from the Shrewsbury meeting clerk. And he says John Corliss has 4 Negroes of the male kind, gives their ages. And he says very distinctly, and he, meaning Corliss, is not inclined to give them any learning. And he says he has not seen it his duty to give them their freedom. Apparently, the meeting elders called on the Corliss folks several times, and Corliss resisted. It's also interesting to note that slaveholders like John Corliss refused to educate their enslaved folks for a number of reasons, mainly because they were afraid that if slaves were literate, they could pass messages back and forth and cause problems, which indeed did happen. But Corliss was particularly intransigent about doing anything about the people that he owned. Very common woodcut that I'm sure you've seen many times, illustrating that when folks ran away from their owners, they literally had the clothes on their back and maybe a satchel. In the ad that you saw, they call it a wallet of a couple of changes of clothes. Now, there has been, and I'll bet everyone that knows about this incident has read that Titus, the runaway, went to Virginia. And that was a story for a long time. And it has to do with this. And if you notice the date, it's the day before John took out that ad. So that means that Titus ran away probably a week or so, let's say, before the ad comes out. And of course, this proclamation. And it's a proclamation from this guy who happens to be John Murray, called himself Lord Dunmore. He had been the former British governor of New York, but he was transferred to Virginia, which he did not like. And that was mainly because he thought of it as a backwater. There were plenty of patriot rebels that were up in arms as the revolution is coming forward. Remember that by 1775, the events up in Concord and Lexington had already happened. And so everybody in the colonies are pretty aware of what's going on. So what Dunmore does when he issues this proclamation is he says that he would give freedom to any enslaved people who run away from the patriot masters to fight on his side. The British assumed at the beginning of the revolution that this was only going to be a couple of months. They were going to put down this rebellion pretty easily. And so they put forth this proclamation in Virginia that said, look, come fight with us for a couple of months. You'll be free forever. Well, as we all know, it didn't quite work out the way anybody thought in those days. But what Dunmore did do, and this is, I think, where the legend about Titus comes from, is he established what he called Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. These were probably in the vicinity of 280 to 300 black runaways from mostly Virginia who flocked to Dunmore's side. He formed them into what he called a Ethiopian regiment. And in spite of this image, he didn't arm them. He used them to dig ditches, build fortifications, etc., etc., not much differently than what they had endured when they were enslaved. As you would expect, white people were always worried about black people having armaments. Um, so from these reports, people assume that, well, Titus must have gone down there. That's where he got his military training that we'll talk about later. But in fact, when I went down to the University of Virginia and went through their archives and looked at the rosters of the Ethiopian regiment, there's no one whose name is Titus or anywhere close to it. And I think there's a good reason for that. If you think about how far New Jersey is from where Dunmore and these folks were down in Norfolk, Virginia, you'll understand it. So if Titus decided to walk or ride or whatever he might think from roughly the Rumson, Sandy Hook area down there, he'd have a formidable journey. He'd have to go through New Jersey. He'd have to somehow get across the Delaware River. He'd probably go down the Delmarva Peninsula. Then he'd have to cross the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay. And this would have taken him a couple of weeks. Not only that, people are looking for him. Okay, he's this very distinguished looking guy. He's pretty tall. People who were getting newspapers, how many we don't know, but would have been on the lookout for somebody. He probably didn't have a lot of money, if any, to buy passageways across creeks and rivers, et cetera, et cetera. So it's unlikely that he would take that journey that would take him 2 weeks and expose himself to being caught again. So the obvious then second choice would be, well, maybe he got aboard a ship somehow and came, within a couple of days sailing from somewhere up in the Sandy Hook vicinity. But that presents another problem. He's got to have money unless he stows away. How's he going to do that without being discovered? And when he gets to Norfolk, how's he going to offload from whatever ship he might have stowed away on and find his way to Dunmore, who he knew basically nothing about? Again, recall the dates. When the Titus ran away, he could not have known that Lord Dunmore was issuing this proclamation. It happened probably a week or so later. So I don't think that actually happened. More likely, from what I can find out, Titus went from way down here. You could see maybe my pointer's working in the Rumson Peninsula here. He might have gone, he could have sailed if he took a boat, which there were plenty of small ships in the Navesink and Shrewsbury rivers. He could have got to Sandy Hook. Likely anybody at Sandy Hook in those days who would have been there, mostly Lightkeeper, for instance, or his family would have known who this guy was. So he then probably went on to Staten Island and New York City. Again, this is an assumption I'm making because of what we learn about him later. Titus was quite a catch for the British because he knew the geography of Monmouth County very well. He had been raised there, here actually, and he would have convinced the British that he was a valuable intelligence source to help them in their fight against the colonial rebels. So I know for a fact that he winds up at Sandy Hook, but there's a gap in the records that we have of where he might have been. But it seems more likely that he would be in New York City or Staten Island, where the British, after July of 1776, they controlled all of that. Meantime, the other major character in our story, guy named Joshua Huddy, but everybody called him Jack when he was a young man. He was born in Salem, way down in Southwest Jersey, into, interestingly enough, another Quaker family. Wasn't a very good Quaker, apparently, because by the time he's 21 or 22, the Quakers, what they call, read him out of the meeting, which would have meant they went to him several times, again, the elders in that particular meeting, and said, we need you to reform your ways. You're not in compliance with our beliefs. and he would have refused, and so they would have read him out of their meeting. Now, it's interesting when I went down to Salem to look at all the records about then Jack Huddy, there's no document that I could find that says why this happened. So I don't know what happened. Was he drinking, which would have been, of course, against Quaker principles? Was he hanging around with an unsavory crowd? We don't know. But it was serious enough where, as a very young man, he was not a Quaker anymore. They gave him a couple of chances, however, to come back, and he refused. And then he does what becomes typical of his life that I discovered. Within a few years, he's only a young man. He's still a young man. He's 30, 29, 30. He finds out that there's a widow named Mary Borden, that's her married name, who owns quite a piece of property. And Jack Huddy, as I find out in all the records, is pretty much of an opportunist. He decides that he's going to woo and marry her. How that went, we don't know the details of, but we do know that by something called the right of coverture, Huddy would have immediately upon the marriage owned all her property. And he was not cut out to be a farmer. And he was a very poor one at that event. Because we have another record here just a few years later in 1766, where he has been in so much debt, borrowing for implements and seed and everything else for this farm that he's trying to run, that the sheriff in Salem seizes the property and they try to sell it to get back the debts to the many, many people that Joshua, then Jack Huddy, owed money to, including his in-laws and other people in town. So he's not cut out to be a farmer. He's certainly not cut out to be a businessman. And it gets worse before it gets better. Um, when I went to the Salem County Courthouse and looked at the records, there were at least 12 court cases against Huddy, mostly for defaulting on loans that he had taken out against trying to keep his farm alive. Sometimes he shows up in court, sometimes he has a lawyer show up, he doesn't show up. There's all kinds of records of a sheriff going out and trying to find him. And at one point in 1768, as you see, they put him in the Salem County Jail, where he remains for about 6 months. So his start in life was anything but heroic. And then he engages in a crime that really is the epitome of what his life was back then. It turns out that one of his creditors was a guy named Smith who had died. And when Joshua Huddy finally does get out of jail after petitioning the local government, uh, he goes to Smith's widow's house. And in an attempt, I think, to get himself out from under the debt, he seduces her because I found a court record of Rex, meaning the king, King of England, versus Joshua Huddy. And in that record, he was accused of fornication with this widow Smith. Um, and this was the last time we have any record of Joshua Huddy in Salem County because he takes off. Now, as shocking or as non-shocking as it may be to you, in that year in the colonies, if you were accused of fornication, that was a serious crime. He knew he would have been jailed again, and so he left. Now, he had two young daughters that he brought with him, and then he disappears too from the record for a while. Naturally, he's trying to lay low so that the sheriffs and other people can't find him, and we lose track of him for a while. So it's ironic to me that both of these men, both Ty and Huddy, kind of lay low for a couple of years. And then, of course, the monumental event in our country's history happens in July of 1776. And when that happens, the colonies, the 13 original colonies, are unanimous, at least in this declaration, to begin the fight, the serious fight against the British. And guess what? Huddy suddenly reappears after 2.5 or 3 years absent in Monmouth County. And we know that because we have several documents that he signs. And remarkably enough, a scofflaw, which is what he was, suddenly appears as a captain in the Monmouth militia. Under a couple of lines above him, a man named Daniel Hendrickson, who was a colonel in the militia. Well, how does this happen? Well, it happened for a couple of reasons. One was Daniel Hendrickson had a mill in Tinton Falls, and he was using that mill not only to cut wood before the war, but when the war started up, he started to store ammunition and firearms and other things that the militia were going to use against the British. And what we find out in that record is that Joshua Huddy is suddenly appointed by Freehold's Colonel David Foreman to be a militia captain of artillery to guard Tinton Falls, especially that munitions compound at the old mill there. And why does this happen? Well, somehow or other, Huddy ingratiates himself with David Foreman, who, as you see here, was called by the loyalists, the people who wanted to stay under the control of England, Black David. And that was because during the Revolution, he was a colonel in the local militia, but also a general in the state militia, which was common at the time to have two different ranks in two different organizations. But he was so feared for his ruthlessness when he would capture loyalists, often killing them, hanging them without benefit of trial, and generally brutalizing them, that he earned that nickname. I think Huddy probably met him early on in some action in Monmouth County, of which we have no record. But somehow he gets under the sway of Foreman, who takes care of him for actually the next several years. And then something else interesting is happening in the background of all this. This is an excerpt of an old map. You see up here in the right, of course, this was the Shrewsbury area. There's the Four Corners up there. And way down here is this little village in those days of Colesneck, basically between Freehold and Shrewsbury. It turns out that from New York, a couple of Jewish merchants came down, Levi Hart and Jonas Solomon. And what's unusual about that is, as you probably know, Monmouth County in the early years of the 18th century, and for quite a while, was primarily Dutch and English. And so the religions then would have been Episcopalian or Church of England, of course, Dutch Reformed. You would have had Baptists, but very few Jews. And so these people stuck out. And when they came down, these two men who were cousins, they were literally peddlers. They were going door to door selling goods that they brought from New York to farmers and merchants. And one day, Levi Hart walks himself into the Jacob Applegate family farm in Middletown. And Jacob Applegate just happens to have what he called two spinster daughters. And the irony of that is, of course, that these young women were like 21 and 22 years old. But in those days, if you weren't married by then, you were considered likely not to be married. And Jacob Applegate sees an opportunity and he introduces his daughters to both of these men. And as it turns out, Jonas Solomon marries Rebecca, and his cousin Levi marries Catherine. And they do that within the same month in 1757. And then Levi Hart borrows money from his father-in-law, and he opens up a tavern, which he called Hart's Tavern. And that's why this next reveal is important. It probably looks something like that, a colonial tavern. And as you see in the map, it was at a place that they called Jewstown. It was so unusual to have Jewish people in Monmouth County that when Levi Hart opened up a tavern and a grocery store with his cousin, Solomon, or I should say, Jonas later moves to Freehold, that the people of Monmouth County start to call it Jewstown because of these men. And again, a surprise, perhaps certainly to me when I found this out, was here is the complete document of the enslaved people, or at least their owners, in Shrewsbury, taken in 1771. And you'll notice that also on the left is Jonas, now calling himself John Solomon, who's got one enslaved person, and Levi Hart also has one. And again, if you look, most people, with the exception of John Corley's and Michael Carney and some others, have fewer than four slaves. They have one in this case. And these people would have been, if they were men, field hands. If they were women, they would have been working in the houses or in the fields as well. So quite common, unfortunately, in Monmouth County in those days. It struck me as very odd to think that a minority would also have an enslaved minority, but they did. And then life changes for Catherine Hart because Levy dies in 1775. And you see all of these events I'm describing are happening just as the revolution is warming up. Um, and that is a crucial part of our story for what happens next. Now, Hart's Tavern, by the way, I hope you know, is and this is an older picture, what becomes over time the Colesnick Inn, because it was right there at the intersection of two major roads where you would put a colonial tavern back in those days. Just fast forwarding a bit for a second, you'll recall the Battle of Monmouth happened, of course, on that bloody, hot, humid Sunday in 1778, where George Washington and Henry Clinton fought to what basically has been described as a draw. That famous image there, I hope, is a huge portrait that has been forever at the Monmouth County Historic Association Freehold, where it rightly belongs. And it's apocryphal, but a lovely and wonderful image. Clinton's got any number of images. The backstory here is that the British in 1778 decided to abandon Philadelphia because the French had joined on the side of the patriot rebels, and the British were afraid that the French would sail up the Delaware, blockading them, so they couldn't retreat the way they would have preferred to come down the river in the British fleet. Clinton decides he's going to march in very long, probably 10-mile long wagon trains across New Jersey. He wants to get to Sandy Hook, where he can be evacuated with his troops up to New York. George Washington and any number of other people are tracking Clinton's movement as he comes across the state. And on June, when Clinton gets to around the Freehold area, Washington, who's in Englishtown, finds out about it and decides he's going to have a battle. It's a monumental battle for a couple of reasons. It's the last major land battle of the Revolutionary War, a set piece battle, two big armies, Washington's Continental troops, supplemented by some militia, and of course, Henry Clinton's well-trained British Army. And they meet and clash just a little bit north of Freehold in the Manalapan area. Now, what's interesting about that battle is that you probably know more details than we'll discuss tonight, is that it went on during this brutally hot day. Men were falling over on both sides, not only from wounds and musket fire and cannon fire, but from heat exhaustion. You get the legend of Molly Pitcher out of that kind of story. In those days, what they did was when it got to be, early evening, both sides were exhausted. And as was their practice, they would stop fighting, rest overnight, and resume the next day, which is what Washington fully expected to happen. But the British had other plans. They left their campfires burning in their places that they held as a disguise. Now, originally, they were going to flee as they walked across New Jersey through Freehold, taking that southern route, as you see here in red, up through the Rumson Neck Peninsula to get to Sandy Hook. But unfortunately, they found out through spies that they would have to therefore pass Hart's Tavern, where they didn't know that it was Joshua Huddy, but they suspected there were militia troops there. So, because they learned this, they changed their plans overnight. And very early in the next morning on a Monday, without Washington and the exhausted rebel and the Continental Army troops being aware of it, uh, Clinton tells Wilhelm von Kniphausen, who's the head of the wagon train, to take a different route. And they do. The British Army evacuates and they go north through, you might know it in the Freehold, Middletown area, Dutch Lane, out here, outlined here in white. And they're slogging along on these muddy, sandy roads at a very slow pace. Turns out that the militia troops find out about that, and Joshua Huddy takes a quickly formed group of cavalrymen, maybe 20 at most, and he heads up what he can, probably not too far from Route 34 today, and he attacks the British, which is foolhardy for this reason. He's attacking the entire British army in that place in Vanderburg, part of today's Kolsneck. He gets his men off their horses and they charge. They do a bayonet attack, and they get beaten back very quickly by the overwhelming number of people that they're attacking. And to this day, if you go along Dutch Lane in Kolsneck at Vandenberg, you will see one of Huddy's men that got killed there. His gravestone's been there for a couple of hundred years now. A man named Michael Field. Actually, he was a young kid. He was 19 years old. Uh, he was one of several people lost on both sides. But his little pocket park was put up by the folks in Kolsneck many years later to celebrate his death. But what I'm bringing out here for you is that Huddy is this adventuresome, reckless kind of person who is probably the kind of person you want fighting for you, but he's not necessarily going to be as successful as you'd like. Now, to get back to our other story, part of our story, is that right after that battle in the early fall, we've got a marriage record here of Joshua Huddy again. And what does he do? Somehow he ingratiates himself with Catherine Hart, the widow. She marries Huddy. The picture there is of the Dominie or the Reverend Benjamin Dubois. And what this means is that a ex-Quaker, Joshua Huddy, marries a Baptist widow of a Jew in a Dutch Reformed church where a ceremony is performed by a former Huguenot minister. And when I discovered all of that, I said, well, that's America writ large, or writ small in this case, if I've ever heard it. Again, not uncommon. But Huddy being Huddy, I have to assume did not marry for love. He married for the same reason he did the first time, because within months of that marriage, he kicks out Catherine of her house and tavern with her four younger children. She had a couple of adult children that were already married that were out of the house. And he forces her out because, again, Huddy is now, as the head of household, the husband, owns all that property, all the 50 acres, the tavern business, the home, and he has no time for her children. They go to wind up living in Freehold with another daughter of hers family. Just again, showing the kind of man Joshua Huddy was. So he takes over the business. They use the business, or he uses the business as a meeting place for his militia. And thanks to both Dana and Joe at the Historic Association, they laid out for me one day, and I took a picture of the last remnant we have of Joshua Huddy. This is actually in Freehold at the museum. It's the key to his house, which miraculously has gotten passed down by relatives over the years to the Historic Association. As I mentioned, Hart's Tavern becomes a meeting place. You should probably remember that although there's this big war going on, as it plays out in Monmouth County, it's largely a civil war with family fighting family, depending upon loyalist or um, rebel sentiments, neighbor against neighbor, friends against friends, and it's a very hectic time. It's called a civil war by many, many people because of the way it played out. And one of the ways it plays out is that when loyalist farming families or businessmen are attacked or suspected of working against the new and independent governments that are arising throughout Monmouth County and the colonies, they're forced to flee their homes and they wind up out in Sandy Hook at a place they call Refugee Town where they conduct raids. And it's a mixed group of white escaped, people from their own homes and escaped slaves that wind up assembling at Sandy Hook, which after July of 1776 was under the control of the British. And thus begins the raids that go on for several years. These refugees would row across Sandy Hook Bay. They would meet other loyalists. They would get horses, wagons, whatever they needed, and they would raid various and sundry rebel houses, including one in what was then called Middletown Point. It's actually today Mattawan. You might know the Burroughs House is now the Mattawan Historic Society's headquarters. And on one of these raids, a group of men called Skinner's Greens, named after Cortlandt Skinner, once an attorney general in New Jersey, come across, and because John Burroughs is a pretty wealthy guy, he's fighting the British. He's got ships that are taking grain everywhere. He's called the Corn King because he's got so many valuable crops. His son's also John Jr. is a militia captain, and they decide to raid his house. They burn several of his boats. They don't destroy his house, but in the reports that we have, they're accompanied by black fighters. And I believe it's the first time that Titus, who is now being called Ty, is coming across, and he does this multiple times during the next several years to raid into Monmouth County rebel families. Um, and then another character central to our story shows up. You all know, I'm sure, Four Corners in Shrewsbury. On one side, you have what we call the Allen House today. It was then the Blue Ball Tavern. Across the highway there, which is now Route 35 and Sycamore Avenue, you have, of course, Christ Church. And it turns out that in June of 79, there were Continental troops stationed at the Blue Ball Tavern, and troops being what they are, they were bored, and they looked across the street and saw at the top of Christ Church steeple two things. They saw a globe under the crown, the ornate crown of the King of England. Of course, the Church of England, Christ Church, represented exactly what they were fighting against. So they started to take pot shots at this thing, and whether or not they were bad aim or maybe on purpose, they wound up hitting this globe several times. And local loyalists find this out. The word gets out very quickly to the folks out at Sandy Hook, and they're enraged that this would happen. And they send another group of men across to take vengeance on this. And they come up probably Parker's Creek by boat. And then they walk or ride if they were able to get horses. They hide in the Christ Church graveyard. You might even see in this picture a little bit back there. That's the Allen House. That was then where the Continental troops were. And they perform under a guy named Richard Lippincott a bayonet charge. And they kill several of these Continental troops. They capture a bunch of them. They take their weapons. And this is all because they were enraged, among other things, by what was happening to Christ Church. This has come down to us as the Allen House Massacre. They take their captives, by the way, back to Sandy Hook. I want you to remember Richard Lippincott's name. He's a prime player in our drama here. This is a picture I took a few years ago of the actual globe that was shattered by the musket fire of the Continental Army that day in June 79. It's not the one that's on the church now, that's a replacement. And if you look carefully, it's hard to see. I know right here in a piece of wood is a musket ball that was also extracted from that steeple. And I'm happy to tell you that Christ Church has preserved this all these years. Moving forward pretty quickly, a month later in the newspaper, we get a report, which is once again pretty harrowing to read about. And it's no doubt that it's Colonel Ty, which is how Titus the Runaway is now being called. And one newspaper report says that about 50 of these refugees come across from Sandy Hook. They go up to Tinton Falls. They surprise and take off, none other, capture Daniel Hendrickson and several other prominent militia leaders. And they take with them, because they couldn't resist, the sheep and cows as they're going to make their way back to Sandy Hook. They would always do that. Not only were they interested in, firing on and hurting people that were fighting against them, but they needed provisions, so they would steal their cattle. But in this case, it's a mistake because of what happens. So it's likely because we have other reports, that Colonel Ty, as he's now being called, is part of this raid and several others during this period of time. Now, you have to know that Colonel Ty is an honorific. The British never promoted black folks that ran away to their side into real military rank. But he earned this nickname because apparently he was well revered by the people who he eventually leads. He's not only a guide throughout Monmouth County to these refugees, but he, in fact, takes small bands of men himself and leads them. So they begin to call him Colonel. Again, he didn't have that official rank. On the way back, my point of pointing out what they had done with the cattle that they stole was they're making so much noise that they're tracked by militiamen. And there's another so-called battle at Black Point, again, the far eastern tip of Rumson, where several people are killed, including one of the POWs that they had taken. Probably the most famous, and I call it the most audacious raid that Colonel Ty perpetuates during his service for the British, happened in broad daylight. As you would expect, most of the raids happened at night. They could come in under cover of darkness, of course. But at some point by June 1780, the refugees in Sandy Hook are feeling confident enough in themselves and Colonel Ty that they're going to risk something a little bit more momentous. And it turns out that they're going to go into a little village part of Middletown named called Homedale. And the reason they're going to do that is because at least these three men, who here are, by the way, all related, are part of what the British thought of as the Hornet's Nest group of rebel patriots who were constantly a thorn in the British side. They lived right there in the shadow. Basically, this is Willowbrook here in Homedale. And when Ty and the men come across, they have the audacity to come across in broad daylight. They probably come through Middletown. They rush into this part of Middletown, into this area where they're going to capture and disrupt these militiamen. One of the reasons they're doing that is that Barn Smock here, and this is obviously a Dutch family, had a cannon that was famous because he would fire that cannon whenever there was suspected British movement or loyalist movement in his vicinity. And that was the signal for men to assemble over here at what becomes the Homedale Baptist Church years later. That was the assembly point. But this day he was taken by surprise so early in the morning by Colonel Ty and Ty's troops, both black and white, by the way, that they don't get a chance to do that. And not only does Ty capture these three, he also, during that engagement, spikes their cannon, this famous cannon. And what that means is he takes either a spike, literally, or perhaps a bayonet, and they bang it into, force it into the touch hole on the cannon, and therefore the cannon is then and forevermore um, uh, unusable. So this is a pretty strong blow at militia forces. And then he takes these men again back to Sandy Hook. And in those days, capturing militia officers was very valuable because the practice was that if you were an officer, you would be exchanged for captured British officers. This went on quite frequently during the war, not so much for enlisted men. That's a whole nother horrible punishment that you'll find out in a few seconds. Um, what's remarkable about a couple of these events, including this one, is that David Foreman, who is known as George Washington's eyes and ears because his responsibility is to guard the coast of Monmouth County, writes this letter that we have in the archives of Washington, telling George Washington, sorry, all about this incident and also about the killing of another man in Middletown. That we'll talk about some other time. So Washington gets word of this. Washington's very aware of Colonel Ty, even in this kind of late stage of the revolution. What about Joshua Huddy? Well, Joshua Huddy winds up the next thing we know that we have record of down in Tom's River. That part of our county was still in Monmouth County. You know, of course, that in 1850, Ocean County separated. But back during the War of the Revolution, Tom's River was across from a no longer extant inlet, then called Cranberry Inlet here on the mainland. North would be up this way. Um, and Tom's River is a pirating port. It's a little tiny town, but here in these coasts and coves, you have small schooners who are bringing goods up and down the coast of New Jersey, mainly involved with this man, James Randolph. And James Randolph has, among other things, a huge plantation there to the north of the Tom's River itself, where he's got something that he called the Pennsylvania Salt Works. There were many salt works along the Jersey shore that the British were always attacking. Salt was necessary not only for preserving food, but it was an ingredient in gunpowder. So it's very valuable. And so Randolph is there, and Huddy gets word of that through Foreman, and he goes down there, ingratiates himself with James Randolph. And the next thing we have with his name on it is this. It's a letter of marque issued by the Continental Congress, only 4 of which were issued to New Jersey residents during the war. And it's basically a grant of piracy. Letter of marque says that you were able to attack with your boat British shipping. You would be able to keep some of what you confiscated. Obviously, you could take prisoners. The whole object was to disrupt British ships. And they did that in a way that you might find unusual. But if you notice here on this record in Congress, we have that the owners of this Black Snake, which is what they call the boat, James Randolph, who owned all this property, and Joshua Huddy and Company, which means that Joshua Huddy and whatever crew he assembled would have split some of the proceeds of anything they took if they raided British ships. Now, what did the Black Snake look like? It was probably a whaleboat with about 16 men aboard, probably rowed. They might have stepped a mast on it and maybe sailed it a little bit. Probably had a swivel cannon at the front of it. Very small craft, but therefore easy at night, especially to slip up to British ships of any kind of size under cover of darkness and board them and wreak havoc where they could, which was the whole idea of these letters of marque and these pirate ships, basically. By the way, both sides had these kinds of attack boats, if you will, both the British loyalists and also folks working for the rebel side. So Honey gets his commission in August of 1780, and he's all set to start on a new mission in life. Part of that is because he's well known as a militia captain at his various exploits in Monmouth County, and he's a target from British spies, other loyalists. So he's looking for a way to be a little safer, and also, as always with Joshua Huddy, a way to get a little richer. And then he makes a big mistake. He decides before he's actually going to take command of this black snake to go back to Colt's Neck for a couple of days. And he does that. And he goes back to his house. And once again, he gets befoiled because he is betrayed by another loyalist spy who announces to some other loyalists that Huddy's back at his house, where he hasn't been in quite a while. Um, and we have then the incident where our two perpetrators meet. And it happens a couple of weeks after Huddy gets the commission. It turns out that up at Refugee Town, they rode down several troops, probably a couple of dozen, with Colonel Ty to Black Point. They take a land route overnight to Jewstown, what is now Colt's Neck. They wait overnight in the woods, and in the morning they surround Huddy's house and tavern, and they expect a big fight. And they get one. And although some of the early reports you and I have read said, oh, it went on for hours, it probably didn't last much more than 20 minutes. They surrounded his house, and they were really surprised because from every window in Joshua Huddy's house, they're being fired upon. So during that engagement, Colonel Ty gets wounded in the wrist. Then other people get shot. And what the British besiegers notice is that there is firing from every window in this house, and they think there's got to be a good-sized militia in there. But in fact, it was Joshua Huddy and his maid who were the only people in there. And they had set up muskets at a lot of the windows in the house. And as Joshua Huddy, as you can see here in this depiction, would take a shot, he would run downstairs, let's say, to another window. This woman, a young woman named Lucretia Emmons, would follow him, reload. He would take another shot and then run to another window. And they did this because Joshua Huddy had made a second mistake. He had let the militia guard, usually about half a dozen men that was always with him, go home that night to visit their own families. And he was all alone thinking that nobody knew he was there. And so this firefight goes on for, several minutes. And finally, the British had enough of it. And they run up and they set fire to the front door of Huddy's house. He sees that the end is near, and he waves on the tip of his musket, apparently probably a piece of a bed sheet or something, and he surrenders. And he says, "Give me quarters," which means don't kill me, take me captive. They agree. The British run up, put out the fire. They let Lucretia Emmons go. We know about her because later in life she was very happy to tell that story. And the British, when they finally take hold of Joshua Huddy, are so enraged they want to kill him on the spot, no matter their promise. They're especially angry that he shot Colonel Ty, who's now wounded and bleeding. But cooler heads prevail, and they take him back along the same route, and they're going to bring him captive back to Sandy Hook. But again, being greedy and hungry, they take his cattle with them. And they're making this racket as they go through all these streams on the way back and the rivers they have to cross. The cattle are slowing them down, and the militia catches up with them as the British, with their captive, Joshua Huddy, get into some boats at Black Point. And in the havoc that breaks out then, the boats overturn. Huddy swims back toward the Black Point shore while the firing is going on from the militia that followed them. And he gets in the water. Apparently, he gets wounded in the hip, and he's yelling out, "I am Huddy, I am Huddy." In other words, he's worried that he's going to get shot by his own militia. So he yells, and they cease fire for a second. They drag him up on shore into the woods. And then the British go about their way, although a lot of they had four, their boats are overturned as well. So Huddy once again escapes mayhem. But once again, he is a marked man, and he can't obviously go back to Colt's Neck, his home, because everybody knows where he lives now, and he's afraid he'll get besieged again. So he goes into hiding, probably under the protection of David Foreman. And he's traveling around doing all kinds of things for the next couple of months. And then, as you know, and this is an important part of our story, by the fall of 1781, the British get trapped by the French fleet and Washington's troops, and they surrender at Yorktown. And we've all been told and want to believe that that's the end of the war, but it's not really the end of the war. It's the end of these huge army conflicts. But people are still enraged after 6 or 7 years of this outraged attacks on them on both sides. So people keep fighting. Not everybody gets the word, of course, and it has a big influence on what happens next because Joshua Huddy gets reassigned back to Tom's River. And he goes back there because he is put in charge of what is called a blockhouse, but it was really just this tiny fort, a wooden frame fort. I got this sketch that was done at the Ocean County Historic Society years after this, where the so-called blockhouse was. And it looked probably something just like this, very small. Those ladders you see here on the right side were the only way in and out. They didn't even have doors or gates on this thing. They probably had swivel cannons at the extremities and the corners, a little house here for men to live and cook. And these guys under Huddy, probably about 2 dozen men, think that nothing's going to happen now. It's, several months after the surrender at Yorktown, they're just going to kind of patiently wait out the end of the war and hope that they can go back to their former lives. But the British find out. Again, this spy network was incredible. And so they send down from New York a wonderfully named ship called the HMS Arrogant. They go into the new inlet, but it's shallow in Barnegat Bay, so they offload it to smaller boats and they march up. In this map, it's called Goose Creek, but it's really Tom's River. And they do the same thing as always. They surround this fort. They yell for Huddy to give out. They don't necessarily know he's in there, but they know there's militia in there. And famously, Huddy yells back at them, "I'm not going to surrender. Come and take it if you can." And ensues then this battle. Again, these battles are a lot shorter and more deadly than you might think. The British bring ladders up to the fort. They get pushed back. They get bayoneted. They get shot at. They finally breach the wall. They've got overwhelming force there. Huddy's running around resupplying his men with ammunition, doesn't get a scratch remarkably, but he does get captured at the end of it. And they're forced to give up after losses on both sides. And then Huddy and two other militia captains, or I should say lieutenants in that case, get taken by the British back to New York, and they're put into one of the famous and infamous sugar house warehouses, which become prisoners, POW jails during the war. And the notorious, the records we have suggest that in the sugar houses and also the formerly HMS Jersey prison ship in Brooklyn Harbor there, upwards of 20,000 POWs died from hunger and lack of clothing and heat, all of that. So Huddy's put there, and he suspects because he's a captain that he'll be exchanged, which probably was going to happen. But it didn't quite happen that way. In fact, he gets moved around from the sugar house to the jail in town, and then eventually this guy, you remember Richard Lippincott, who was in the incident at the Allen House, he gets orders to take Huddy and exchange him, which is what Huddy hoped, for prisoners who were in the Monmouth County Jail in Freehold. And so Lippincott takes him and a couple of other men by ship, of course, back to Sandy Hook up here. And he's still in chains. And a couple of days go by, and Huddy is taken from the prison ship where he's right in probably Horseshoe Cove. And Lippincott and several other men take him across to this place here, which was called Gravelly Point on the Highlands shore, then part of Middletown. They take a barrel and they have Huddy sign his will. And in the background there is the actual will of Joshua Huddy that is now in Washington, D.C. And what's remarkable about the document is that it's in two different hands. The signature of Joshua Huddy at the bottom is not the same hand as wrote that note, his last will and testament. And that's because it had been pre-written, probably in New York, possibly by Richard Lippincott, who had no intention of following his orders, which was to exchange Huddy. Lippincott was so infuriated by what had happened to him and his family during the war that he decided that he's going to summarily execute, and does, Joshua Huddy on the spot. And he pinned to Joshua Huddy's jacket this other preserved note we have, which famously ends with "Up goes Huddy for Philip White." And that was Richard Lippincott's way of saying, you are being hanged in retribution for the hanging of a loyalist named Philip White. And Lippincott knew all too well that Joshua Huddy had nothing to do with the killing of Philip White, which happened on the road to Freehold while Huddy was in jail in New York. But it didn't matter to Lippincott. He was going to do what he was going to do. Now, there was a legend for the next 100 years in Highlands of something called the Huddy tree, where Huddy had been hanged. And I can't tell you in what I'm about to say next that I have this 100% accurately, but this is an old postcard image. And if you notice on what is Waterwitch Avenue today, these are the railroad tracks that were put in many years later. There are two men by a fallen down tree, about where the people in Highlands had kept the legend that Joshua Huddy was hanged. Now, when I was a kid, I was fortunate enough to grow up in the Highlands in the summer, where my parents got us a bungalow. And I heard that legend. And these railroad tracks, I knew very well as a kid. Of course, they weren't there when Joshua Huddy was there. But it turns out that in the 1930s, on the north side, which would have been here, of that railroad track, the Monmouth County Historic Association helped erect a monument to the place where Joshua Huddy was hanged. And here's an original photograph from the Asbury Park Press of where that monument stood. When I was a kid, and I didn't know this then, in the 1940s, around the time of the end of World War II, Highlands took over this park here, and they moved that Huddy monument right there. And I knew it very well because it was a place we hung out when we were kids there. And in fact, it has now come to us to be known as Huddy Park. And famous people from all over come and visit Huddy Park. You'll never know who shows up there. And here they are at a monument that I must have read who knows how many dozens of times when I was a kid, thinking that was where Huddy was hanged and thinking that this was this heroic man who had done all these wonderful things, which of course, in fact, he did. I had no idea what the full story was that I'm giving you an outline of tonight about the kind of man he actually was. But to continue our story, when George Washington finds out from David Foreman what happened, that Huddy was hanged not only after the official British surrender, but without benefit of trial, he is enraged enough to take 16 of the POWs that he had captured at Yorktown, these British officers, and at a place in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, he assembles them. He asks their commander, this guy here, James Gordon, to pick one of them to be hanged in retribution for Huddy. And Gordon says, no, absolutely not. I'm not going to do that. And so they take two drummer boys and into two hats. One drummer boy puts 16 pieces of paper with the name of each one of these British officers in it. And this drummer boy has another hat with 16 pieces of paper, 15 of which are blank, and one has the word written on it, unfortunate. And the drummer boys are commanded to pick out one from one hat. And if we'll say, for example, George Eld here's name comes out, and from the other hat comes out a blank piece of paper, he's off the hook. And this goes on for several rounds until, unfortunately, Charles Askill, a 21-year-old British lieutenant, gets picked. And he's the man who now Washington is going to hang. But he's not going to do it right away. He says to Major Gordon, look, I want you to take him back to New Jersey. Gordon, who's on parole, which was common then, was allowed with some guards to take Charles Askill, this young man, back to New Jersey. And that also gives Washington time to figure out what he wants to do, because there's obviously backlash to this. There's a picture of or a painting of Charles Askill, but the backlash is more severe than you might have suspected, that I certainly ever suspected for an incident like this. And it turns out that Washington contacted the British in New York. Clinton had been replaced. And in order to slow Washington's endeavor to hang this man, the British say, listen, we'll take Lippincott and we'll put him on a court-martial trial and we'll get justice. You know, we sort of understand your point, George Washington. And Washington's pretty happy about this because he's not terribly comfortable with executing somebody who he knows is innocent, but he's given his word that he's going to take retribution. So the British take, and again, it's a military court-martial, this Captain Lippincott, and they have a 2-week trial. And as it should be no surprise to anybody, they find him not guilty, which further enrages Washington. But it sets in motion a couple of other events, because during this month or so when all these things are going on, the word gets across the ocean by ship, of course, to the peace commissioners in Paris who are trying to end the war. It's in Paris because the French are our allies. There are British folks there who are also fighting the French. And the three major powers in this war are trying to come to a ceasefire and eventually a treaty of truce. And when the commissioners, including Benjamin Franklin in the middle there, find out what Washington's intent is, they panic because they realize that if Washington hangs Charles Askill, it's not going to go well for the peace treaty negotiations, particularly because Charles Askill's mother's a French citizen who happened to marry a British guy. So begins a series of letters back and forth to try to forestall Washington's vengeance. And luckily, Benjamin Franklin had made friends with the French foreign minister, a guy named Charles Gravier, who was called the Duke of Vernier. And Vernier, luckily for everyone involved, was very well acquainted with and very close to these people. And Vernier takes a letter that he receives from Charles Askill's French mother to Marie Antoinette, of all people, and he says, Your Highness, you'll never believe what they're going to do in America. They're going to hang one of our citizens' sons who's innocent. And if this happens, our peace treaty will be, our negotiations will grind to a halt. We'll never put an end to this war. What do you think? And of course, Marie Antoinette goes to her husband, Charles XVI, and they write a letter, and through Vergennes, it gets back across the ocean to George Washington, who all this time has been hoping for a way out of his dilemma. Because although he's angry, he knows that if he hangs this young, innocent man, it's not going to go well for anybody. And he finally gets the letter. He goes to Continental Congress, and they release from imprisonment Charles Askill in November of 1782 after about a 6-month ordeal of this young man. Now, because the way things moved in those days, it took another several months for the official peace treaty, who you can see here signed by some very famous names in our history, to go into effect. And it turns out that after Askill was released, he in fact does go back to Great Britain. He makes a courtesy call to the King and Queen of France in a few months and thanks them for his release. Sounds like it all went well at the end, doesn't it? But we forgot about the main player here. What about our friend Colonel Ty? So just to recap, we know that he was born at Black Point under the control and ownership of the Corliss family in 1754. He was a young kid, spent the first probably 20 years of his life there. We know too that by 1779, he has become famous on both sides of the war as Colonel Ty. He's stationed at Sandy Hook, where he's making incursions into the mainland of Monmouth County to attack rebels and patriots wherever he can. And what I think happened, in spite of the legend, and the legend is this: it's been long assumed that Colonel Ty got wounded, as we know, in the wrist, and because there were not enough antibiotics, or any in those days actually, that he died, and he died of typhus, or not, probably not typhus, lockjaw, or something like that. And in fact, we've got letters from a local doctor who writes about the incident who mentions nothing about that. He doesn't mention anything, nor does anyone else. And after a certain point in time, there's no newspaper reports, there's no battle reports. We never hear of Colonel Ty again. He just disappears. And that date is very important because the day he disappeared was the day the British boats that were overturned as the militia pursued Joshua Huddy in the Shrewsbury River of September 1780. It's likely that in that havoc and confusion, Colonel Ty was thrown or jumped into the water as well. And if he was wounded, and even if he could swim, which I don't know, he's handicapped. He can't swim back toward Black Point because that's where the militia is. So he might have tried to get to, the mainland, or I should say, the outer banks of Sandy Hook in what is today Seabright, but there's never any follow-up. We have nothing from the British. There's no burial. There's no marker. Of course, they wouldn't have spent a whole lot of time worrying about black troops anyway. And I really and firmly believe that he drowned, which is why we have never heard of him again after that point. Now, here's a question I'd like you to ask yourselves. What about these two men? Huddy has always been acknowledged as a patriot hero, which indeed he was. We know now a lot about his personal life, which puts him in a different light. But both of them were doing the same thing, essentially. Titus was fighting for his personal freedom and independence. Huddy for this new country of ours. Um, I'll leave it up to you to think of who believed in their causes. What you know now about Joshua Huddy and what I know makes me think about what his real motivations were. I can't know Ty's motivations other than he certainly was hoping that he would help the British win the battles so that he could become a free man. How were they looked upon by their troops? Interestingly enough, we know that Ty was certainly well thought of, enough for them to give him an honorific of colonel. Huddy, in some reports we have, was a pretty brutal commander. And like his protector, David Foreman, kind of ruled his troops with an iron hand. So that's another way to look at him. And then again, I'd like you to think about how we've honored these men. These are two men instrumental in the founding of this country. One happened to pick the winning side, the other didn't. We honored, as would be expected, Joshua Huddy. And by the way, we honored him because in 1832, his daughter, his remaining living daughter, petitioned Congress for a pension. And that notoriety brought a lot of attention to what her father, who had been forgotten for 50 years, had done. And suddenly we see parks and monuments all over Monmouth County about him. And Ty, for many, many years, decades actually, is never mentioned again until late in the 1880s. People started investigating, historians, and seeing his name, and thus begins his legend. But he's certainly not as celebrated as in some ways he might be. I'll leave that for you to determine. So there's a whole lot more in the book I wrote, and I was happy to spend the number of years I did to find out some of these things, some of which I've revealed to you tonight. So if you've got anybody still with us, Dana, and you want to open up the questions, I'll be glad to help where I can. Anybody who would like a signed copy of the book, as you see there, you can get a hold of me. Dana will no doubt post my um, email, and I'd be happy to correspond with you about getting a signed copy.
Sure.
So
Ooh,
thank you.
okay, so fancy. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, there was definitely some stuff in there that I did not know. So good job. You're getting applause. That's good. All right. So let's see. So we had 161 people tonight. That's great.
Very
Does
nice.
anybody
Thank
have
you,
any
everyone.
questions? Getting lots and lots of clapping, I see. Any questions? Up from Karen and Glenn. Well researched, tons of information. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yep, Rick, you always do a great job. Let's see, what else have we got? Learned a lot. Sometimes I think when you don't have so many questions, it's because you did a really good job
Or I put them to sleep, one or the other.
answering them. I don't think everybody's sleeping. I think they're clapping. That's good.
Hey, have you posted my email for folks too?
How do we do this? Hold
Well,
on.
I
Put it
can
up
I can give
there.
it to you. It's pretty easy.
You
Uh,
want to drop it? Yeah, why don't you put it in the chat so I
okay, I'll do that in the meantime if I can find the chat.
Oh, there we go. To everyone. Hold on. It's what is it? Rick?
Rick G
Uh-huh.
0817 at Yahoo.
7 yahoo.com.
So once again, if you'd like me to sign a copy and dedicate it to you, I can certainly do that when you get a hold of me. And there's any number of ways you can see there that you can purchase that book.
Right. And then you get a free picture of me and Joe. So
You do. You get a picture of Dana and Joe, who I left anonymous there, knowing full well that you'd all know who they were.
that's good. You know me. I fought you on that one.
She did. She's too modest for someone who's so accomplished.
Um, no questions. Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, I think you did a really amazing job. Very
Okay. So the good news is that those who do want to question me know where I can be located or can
Mhm.
email me, whichever, or go through you, Dana, whatever's appropriate. And I'm certainly happy to
Oh,
do that. Did
hold
somebody
on one
pop up with a
second.
question?
Yeah, I see we have
Ah,
a
okay.
raised
Yep.
hand. Usually we do it through the chat, but
Okay, well, I can read one. Someone is, I guess Brian's asking, is there anything left of his house? And the answer is no. And if you go to the Colthank Inn today and you look at the road that's right next to the inn, there's a plaque there where they believe the Huddy house was. I happen to find a newspaper article in, I want to say 1884, but I can't know off the top of my head. His house was burned down eventually. So there's no remaining trace of that house any longer.
okay, we have someone asking what became of Richard Lippincott?
Ah, great question. Thank you for that. So Lippincott, as you know, gets declared not guilty. And he, like so many other British black and white who fought on the loyalist side, gets transported up to Canada. He petitions the British Parliament in a few years, and they grant him, you won't believe it, hundreds of acres of property in Canada where he and his family resettle. He's buried up there. It's in the book. There's a picture of his grave, and there's a Lippincott Street named after him. And I read, as you would not be surprised, several reports from his descendants who claim that he was this wonderful, heroic guy and all of this kind of stuff. And that's not uncommon on anybody's side. People always aggrandize their relatives in spite of what we now and consider to be the truth. I don't think Lippincott was a honorable guy for the hanging of Joshua Huddy. But then I wasn't in his shoes during the revolution where friends and family were being killed. So I'll leave it up to you to decide which.
Okay. Someone's asking if you can tell them if the British route was through any part of Holmdel and what are the current roads?
So if they're talking about the British route from the Battle of Monmouth, that northern route that I pointed, it actually went through Dutch Lane and then into Middletown, down the long way down what is now Neversink River Road, of course, and then to around where Bar's Landing Restaurant is now, where they erected a bridge out of boats for the troops to get across. It took them a couple of days, by the way, and I also believe that Colonel Ty was there helping them. It used to be believed, as did I, that Colonel Ty was at the Battle of Monmouth, but he was not. I can assure you of that from some other scholars that I've talked to. But he was in and around there. Um, Holmdel saw, as you know now, actions during the war, but not the specific retreat of the British. If you've ever been on, and I'm sure you have, what we call Buttermilk Valley Road in Middletown that leads up to the Highlands, that was part of the British retreat route.
Mhm. And the hornet's nest?
The hornet's nest, that's an interesting story. That was the what was called the Pleasant Valley area of Homedale. In fact, coincidentally, I used to live out there. But that's a huge area. That goes back from Pleasant Valley Road through what is was and is now Bell Works, and that whole area down Long Valley Road where the smocks were captured was all considered part of Pleasant Valley, where the Dutch had many, many farms with a lot of slaves, by the way. And they were, as you would expect, the Dutch always to be fighting against the British. And it played out here in the colonies as it did in Europe. So yeah, that was part of our story.
Okay. Um,
I have to mention I'm seeing Ron Bennett here, friend of mine, talking about Richard Lippincott was a cousin of his. And those of you who don't know Ron Bennett, I will give him a clap of his own here because he has done tremendous amount of research on his extensive ancestry in Monmouth County. And if he wants to post his email there, he would certainly probably let you know about his ancestry files. And you mention an old Monmouth County family name, and more likely than not, you'll find a Ron Bennett ancestor there.
okay, hold on. I'm trying to get, I don't know why the chat is doing this tonight.
Just a little slow. Looks like
Yeah.
Eddie. I think that might be Eddie Barnes, but hi Ed, if it is, and you asked a kind of the same question about Lippincott.
Okay, so Kelly is just noting that the Jewish Museum in Freehold is opening an exhibit soon on Jews in Monmouth County.
Yes.
Yeah.
In fact, what I know about those Jewish men came directly from there when they were kind enough to let me research their files. And they have a tremendous collection of stuff that went on from the Revolutionary forward. And again, I depended on so many people and so many organizations to do this research, who welcomed me with open arms. Although sometimes Dana was afraid that when I would call up, I would ask her to do more work, I'm sure.
Okay. I think that's it. I don't know why the chat is behaving badly. You know, Zoom sometimes changes things up and it throws me for a loop. Hold on.
Yeah, anything's possible, but I
Ah,
think people know how to get a hold of us, Dana.
yeah, they do. One more question and then we'll close it out. How about the connection with ex-Governor Franklin?
Ooh, really another good question. So I hope you know this all. Benjamin Franklin, of course, everyone knows, but he had an illegitimate son named William, who turns out to favor the loyalist side, becomes the royal governor of New Jersey. He is arrested during the war, put in a prison in Connecticut, finally gets released. He's the guy that you'll find out in my book, and it's a great question. He's the guy that signed the order to take Huddy back to be exchanged for the prisoners in the Freehold jail. We have the written records of that order to Lippincott, who obviously ignored that order and got away with murder, quite literally. So, terrific question. William Franklin Lived, by the way, you probably know the proprietary house up in the Amboys. That was the governor's mansion at one point. He and his father Benjamin, sadly enough, never reconciled for the rest of their lives. William Franklin wound up in England where he died.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's about 8:30. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. Thanks, Rick, for another great presentation.
Thank you all. Dana, thank you too. I want everybody to keep warm. There's only another couple of weeks and we'll be into spring.
Hope so.
Yeah, good.
Sooner
So
than
good
later.
night, all. Appreciate your help, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.